Thank you, Rose, for that awesome introduction. As you guys are coming into this meeting, feel free to type into the chat who you are, what your role is, and something. It doesn't have to just be one word, but something that you think of when you see that image. I chose this image because I feel like it's very calming and peaceful. And so at the end of a long work day, sometimes we just need to center and focus ourselves. So if you see me looking over to the side, that's because I have another computer set up over here so I can kind of monitor the chat. And Rose is going to help me out with that as well. We're a pretty small group today, so if you have something that you want to share, if you have a question, if you have a comment, just feel free to shout it out. And I'm happy to stop wherever I'm at. We don't have to wait till the end for that. I want it to be a collaborative experience for everyone. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so thank you to the Special Education Technology Center and Rose for inviting me here today. I'm very excited to share with you all what we've been doing in Bellevue School District over the past 5 years or so to roll out core vocabulary. Before we get started, Rose told you a little bit about who I am. When I'm not at work, I am at home with my little ones. I've worked for Bellevue School District for 13 years now as a speech language pathologist, and more recently for the past 2.5 years now as an assistive technology specialist as well. I worked for 10 years in our functional life skills program with kids with severe complex communication needs. And then more recently in our inclusion program, which you'll also hear me refer to that as our continuum of service program. Alongside my work in Bellevue, several years back, I was an AAC evaluator at Seattle Children's. I also did about 5 years on our district's autism consulting team, and I was our SLP monitor for about 5 years. And as I mentioned, now I'm an AT specialist. Okay, so let's jump into some learning objectives. So the idea for this talk came from networking conversations with some colleagues outside of my district who were inquiring about my role as AT specialist in Bellevue and my approach to core vocabulary and AAC implementation district-wide. In Bellevue, we're fortunate to have abundant access to technology, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case in order to provide access to communication supports for everyone. In 3 years, our district has made so much growth in providing universal access to communication supports and training for staff. So my hope is that in sharing a little bit about our journey today, that it might inspire other people to do the same. So as I mentioned before, if you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to shout it out because I won't be looking at the chat the whole time. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to briefly talk about what is core vocabulary. I know that's probably a review for most of you all here. I was kind of looking through the chat. It seems like we have mostly SLPs and AT specialists with us, but I will just touch on it briefly. I'm going to talk about AAC as universal communication supports. I'm going to go through in some detail our school district's roadmap to core vocabulary implementation. And then I'm going to leave some time, hopefully at the end, for questions and collaboration. Okay, I like to start all my talks with this slide. It's an image by Kate Ahern, who's a special educator. And the words in this image really ground me in the idea of presumed competence and access for all. So it says, when you choose how many words a child deserves, you are choosing the size of their world. Choose carefully. Okay, when you think about language, the words that we say can be divided into 2 subgroups, core and fringe. Core words are the words that can be used across many contexts, and they're the same for many different people, whereas fringe words are primarily nouns and they're more context specific. So what you see on the slide here, about 80 to 85% of what we all say is communicated with just about 200 to 300 basic words. And core words seem really simple, but they can be combined to communicate more complex ideas. They are consistent across groups of people, activities, places, topics, and they, as I mentioned, they consist primarily of pronouns, verbs, adjectives, and prepositions, whereas the fringe words are more of the nouns. Okay, so why is this key? When a student is given a communication system, it's essential that they have access to core vocabulary. And that's because these core words are, like I said before, they're consistent across people, activities, places, topics, and age groups. And so if you are teaching a student a set of words and you're thinking about that quote that I showed on the image from Kate Ahern, you need to give students words that can be used consistently across their day. By teaching the same set of words in many different contexts, you get greater generalization and faster payoff. So if you think, for example, about a child who's given, let's say, like a quick talker device that has only 12 cells on it, would you rather have a device that has primarily words for snack time, or a device that has words like go and stop and turn and more and all done that can be used consistently throughout the day? I can guarantee, and most of you probably the same, that with proper teaching, the child will get faster payoff and more generalization when they have access to those core vocabulary words, as opposed to the context-specific snack words. So therefore, the goal of core vocabulary is to provide a person with enough words so that they're able to say what they want to say about whatever they want to talk about, whenever they want to say it. And that is called spontaneous novel utterance generation, or SNUG, as we call it in the speech world. So what if we think a little bit more broadly? If we're looking at a whole classroom or a whole school building or even your whole district, if we want to support students with language delays, both expressive and receptive, our multi-language learners, our limited verbal students who do not yet have an AAC system, our students who are learning to read and write, students with unidentified disabilities, and probably more even beyond this list. What can we do from a system level communication standpoint to support all of these students? So we can consider using the AAC system to teach language to everyone. We can move AAC from being a tier 3 only tool to a tier 1 tool by adopting what I like to call a universal communication design approach. Now, this idea can be somewhat controversial in the field of AAC, and I want to be sure and emphasize that because this is a tier 1 tool, it does not mean that it is not also a tier 3 tool for certain individuals. We still need to be sure and customize our support to benefit each individual student. And we'll talk about that more in a minute as well. So in thinking about universal communication design, we can provide access to large core boards, also known as big core boards, and we can make these boards universally available for all students in a classroom or in a school building or even across your whole district. So in a presentation she gave at NWACS last year, 2019, Lauren Enders came and she covered some of the benefits to using these big core boards. These boards slow down our rate of speech because as you're pointing to each word and looking for the word that you want to model while you're talking, you have to go slowly while you're finding all the words. It also forces us to simplify our language and to include more of the core vocabulary or your target vocabulary. It provides visual input to support processing of our statements and comments and questions and directions. If you think about all of the words that are coming out to our students, they are transient, they don't stay there. But if you have this visual input, it's a concrete visual cue that your students can refer back to. It also provides peers with a model of how to use aided language stimulation with their peers who use AAC. So that ALS stands for aided language stimulation. So as you're pointing to words on the big core board, you are showing all the kids in the class how they could point to words while they talk as well. So you're being a model for other models and teaching them how to use it. And there are even more benefits to using a big core board beyond what Lauren Enders shared. Big core boards, as she said, they give that concrete visual representation of language, which supports not just expressive language development, but that receptive understanding as well. We can use these boards to expand expand utterance length, to expand vocabulary, and even to support those early literacy skills. So reading sight words, modeling how you read from left to right, building sentences, and you could even use it to teach first letter spelling and a lot more too. And here's that disclaimer that I mentioned before, one size does not fit all. So just because in Bellevue School District and perhaps in yours as well, we adopt a district-wide, what I like to call a starter system, that does not mean that it's going to be what is best for all students. So remember to consider the individual needs of your students with the help of the SLP. So for example, if your student has visual challenges, you might need to adapt to that. With access difficulties, or if they require voice output, different symbol type. So we are always using this as just a starter and then adapting it to meet the needs of your individual students. Okay, so now it's time to show what we're doing in Bellevue School District to promote the use of big core boards and core vocabulary implementation overall. So here is our whole roadmap of the process that we've taken over the past like 3 years or so to systematically roll out core vocabulary implementation. And I know this slide is a little bit visually overwhelming, so just know that I'm going to take you through each step and give a little more information about each as we go along here. Okay, so the first on our map is establishing an AAC group. It was, I think, about 6 years ago that there was a group of SLPs in my district who all worked with many students who had complex communication needs. So a lot of us worked in that functional life skills program. And we decided that it would be really helpful if we met regularly, just as a way of talking about these complex kids with complex needs. It was, and it still is, completely optional. So whoever is interested opts in to coming. No one is required to come. Originally, we just did this out of the goodness of our hearts to learn more and to collaborate. But eventually we established this group to be a class or a professional learning committee with clock hours available. So that's, a little bit of a carrot now to get people to come because they know they can fulfill some of their professional development hours by coming as well. And we've had a range from only 4 SLPs or, just a handful of SLPs coming to last year. Sometimes we had almost our entire SLP group coming to some of these meetings. So for the first 5 years or so, we met for only about an hour. And we would have 3 people volunteer to present. So we would have someone who would present on a journal article that they read, and they would share what they read and, some application, and then we would all talk about it together. Someone else would bring up a case study to discuss, and the case study could either be a student for whom they've had a lot of success. So maybe they're trying something, somewhat different or unusual in some way, and they've had a lot of success. So they want to share it with the group because it's really cool. Or more often is the case where they want to share about a student who is very complex and who they need a little bit just to talk things through with the group and get some help from other people. And then someone would pick the topic that we would discuss, and that would change in every meeting. Again, this was all voluntary. Last school year, our group increased in size to include, like I said, almost the entire SLP group. So we felt like 1 hour wasn't quite long enough to cover everything that we wanted to discuss. We increased our meeting to an hour and a half. And instead of discussing only journal articles, we opened that part up to be a resource review. So it could be a journal article if the person wanted to cover something that they read that was really interesting, but it could also be like a worthwhile book that they read. They could share therapy materials that they've been using that they really like, websites or blogs that they go to where they find information, or podcasts that they share, and so on. Any resource related to AAC, of course. And then we also added a component called a program tour. And what that is the SLP would share about her building and kind of give an overview of the makeup of the student population, kind of what AAC implementation looked like in that space. And sometimes they'd even have photos of what the actual spaces in the building look like too. And that was really helpful because sometimes as a school-based SLP that it can feel a bit isolating. And so it was nice just to see like what other people were doing in their buildings across the district. This year, obviously everything moved to the remote setting. So we decided to take that part away. The structure of our meetings are basically the same, but instead of doing the program tour this year, we decided to do an AAC app review. So in each meeting, we pick one of the robust AAC apps and we kind of discuss the features of that particular app in each meeting. So we started with Proloquo to Go because we use that a lot in our district, and then Touch Chat, Snap Core, and so on. So the benefits to meeting as an AAC SLP group are tremendous. Obviously, the biggest, in my opinion, is the collaboration. It feels really good to meet with other people who are doing similar things in their buildings. And as I said before, students with complex communication needs are just that. They're really complex. So it's nice to have input from various members of interested individuals who also want to learn, and we learn from each other. It was also a nice space to share new research and resources, and it became a great avenue for standardizing some of the AAC implementation approaches that we use district-wide. So when I stepped into this role as an AT specialist, I really got to see the differences in from building to building in our district. You know, some SLPs are very comfortable with AAC. They learned about it maybe in grad school, or they've had a lot of clinical experience and they run with it. Whereas other SLPs in our district had virtually no experience. They were very uncomfortable with AAC treatment. And so it was interesting to see how different everyone was and to start to implement some approaches that could be used across our district. Okay, so the next step in our rollout plan was to develop our core board that we wanted to use as our big core board. It was, I believe, the end of the 2018-2019 school year that we had kind of talked about it during our AAC group, and we decided we wanted to have one consistent starter board. We had been doing some research and seeing this idea of universal core vocabulary. And so we all met, and together we came up with group consensus on the number of symbols that we wanted on our main core vocabulary board. So this board has 56 symbols. We came up together with an agreement on symbol location, color coding system, and then also which pictures to use to represent each word. So like, for example, you know, the open symbol we decided on, if you can see it, let's see if I can point it out right here. We decided on this one that's open, but the other symbol in BoardMaker for open is like this, but with the arrow going the other way. So there was some disagreement at time on, you know, which symbol to pick for which, but this was where we landed as a group.
Sarah, you have a question. Does everyone make their own boards, or do you have one person who does this for all participants?
I am going to be getting to that in just a few minutes. So I'm going to leave you hanging on the answer to that because we will get to that. Okay, so as you're coming up with your board, I have some helpful hints. My number one helpful hint is to remember to include a variety of skin colors. This was brought to my attention. Actually, I noticed it myself last school year that most of the symbols we had picked had little stick figures that had white skin. And so I went back through and changed some of them to have more of a variety of skin colors. So just try and keep that top of mind when you're creating your board. I also recommend consistency across buildings. It came up when we were making our board that a couple groups wanted to do it slightly different. So most of their board is the same, with the exception of the right side. Our preschool team decided they wanted to have bathroom on the main board. So they moved some of the symbols around and put bathroom on there. And that has caused some trouble as the years go. I mean, for the most part, the board is the same, which is good. But there are certain students who who have changed from, changed levels. They've gone from preschool up to elementary or elementary to middle, and the board is slightly different and there's a little bit of confusion. And also, as I am helping in my role provide some of these universal supports, it has been the case that when I am making some of these boards, I make them look like the board that most people are using. So if it's different in certain buildings, then it looks a little bit different. And then the other helpful hint I had was to create sort of levels of this board, which is what you see actually in this image here, with some symbols that are masked. So we have certain levels, kind of similar to in Proloquo to Go, the progressive language feature, I believe it's called, where the symbols all stay in the same place. So for a student who maybe it's visually overwhelming to look at 56 symbols, they can start at a different level and then gradually more of those symbols are unmasked. And in the event that you don't want to make your own board, perhaps your AAC SLP group can agree upon a symbol set or a specific company board to use. There are now so many of them, and I feel like a lot of these have just come out in the last few months. So I'd say many of the major app and software companies have their own versions of core boards, and some now even have large size files that can be printed and used as big core boards or playground boards. So here's just some examples. The image there is the Saltillo Touch Chat with Word Power board. And Saltillo also has virtual backgrounds. So when you're in your Zoom call or your Teams call or whatever platform you use in your district, they have the photo that can go behind you as a virtual background. And they have translations in English, Spanish, and traditional Chinese. Assistive, the company that makes Proloquo to Go, they have translations also available in English, Spanish, French, and Dutch. There are LAMP and Unity boards, SnapCore First boards, and Lesson Picks. So there's a whole bunch of companies that have boards if you don't want to recreate the wheel, reinvent the wheel. Okay, so back to our roadmap. Here's where I believe I'm going to answer the question that came up, because the next step was creating files for distribution. Okay, so after coming up with our core board, what I did as the AT specialist, I made a master file that could be easily distributed. So this file contains different board sizes. So I have the traditional board or book sizes, I have mini notebook sizes, I have larger like legal size and tabloid size that could be enlarged for really large core boards. I also included example pages of Fringe vocabulary and templates that people could put their own Fringe vocabulary into. Because our board was made in BoardMaker, I made a digital version too that can be used in BoardMaker Player that also has voice output and some simple navigation. So it's really nice for teachers to use on the smartboard for in-class modeling. And then I also enlisted the help of some colleagues to create Mandarin Chinese and Spanish translation. So you see here on this slide, that's the Mandarin translation or part of it. And most recently, I created an image that can be used as a virtual background in Teams as well. And that's what that looks like there. That's me pointing to my virtual background. Another helpful tip is just to keep the master file and each of the individual files in a shared location so that the SLPs and teachers can easily access them all as needed. I put them all in a folder in the file section of our SLP Teams page, but any shared location that can be easily accessed by all would work. Here's an image of some of the various sizes of boards. So the smallest one looks really teeny tiny, but that's actually a standard paper. And then the next one is kind of like a ledger size. And then the bottom one was our first iteration of a large core board. And this is what the digital version of the board looks like. So from within BoardMaker, you can see on the left that I have different pages for some of those, pages that can be navigated to. So like little words, describe, feelings, actions, etc. So this is the edit mode, I guess you call it, of BoardMaker. But if you go into play mode, then you don't see that left column and it's interactive. So that's where you can touch a symbol and it goes into the message window. You can clear the message window and there's some simple navigation as well. I also created some simple PDF files that even have the instructions right on them. This way, others who are less familiar with AAC and core vocabulary could easily help with printing and making the boards and the books. So it's really easy, all in one PDF file with the directions and the images and just step by step what to do. It's really helpful to think about creative ways in which you can recruit other people to help making these boards and books. In our district, an SLP who worked for our transitions program, which is for our students age 18 to 21, they helped put together a work group of these transition students. And they were tasked with printing, laminating, and creating AAC boards and books for their job site. That was what they did for their work. And that group is right now currently on pause due to the pandemic, but it was very useful. They actually wanted more work because they were able to complete it all that quickly. And then recruiting volunteers in buildings to make some of these, just thinking outside of the box, because obviously everyone's really busy, especially right now. And so it's helpful to find other creative ways to distribute the labor.
Sarah, in reference to the last slide, is the board you just showed with other pages available on Boardmaker Online Share? And if so, what is the keyword to look for it?
That is a good question. I do not know if it's on Boardmaker Online. I made that myself, so I'm not sure. But maybe if you search core vocabulary or core and fringe.
Oh, she said the slide before this. Oh, did Sarah?
This one?
The other Sarah Kinsella was asking that.
Oh.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was if this one was out there.
One? No, this is the one that I made, but it actually wasn't that hard to make.
Yeah.
But
okay, thanks.
maybe something else out there. Any other questions? All right, so we can go on now to the big core boards, because I just talked about all the different sizes. Of course, we need to talk about the really big ones. So this is a picture of my deck last summer. I made a whole bunch of these core boards, and these have removable pictures. So behind the color picture is a grayscale picture of the same image, and the color one is Velcroed on. And then what's missing in this picture is a Velcro strip across the top, like gray message window area, so that teachers or therapists could take the symbols off and put them up into that message window to build the sentences. Okay, so we want to get these big boards into as many classrooms as possible, but of course, it's always met with barriers, right? So here's some common ones that I hear all the time. I don't have a board, I don't have time to make one, I don't have funding to pay for it. So I try and help teachers and therapists as much as I can break down those barriers. If we make the board for them or find someone who will, then they can't say that they don't have one and they don't have time to make one. So again, as mentioned previously, it's just important to think creatively about who might be able to help you make them. And we were able to utilize our transitions work group. We also utilized volunteers, paraeducators, me, and other SLPs to make them for their buildings as well. So thinking about funding, again, try and think outside of the box. A couple ideas of things we did in our district. We submitted grant proposals to our Bellevue Schools Foundation to get grant money to pay for materials for these large boards. That was one way that one avenue that some school buildings took. Some buildings tapped into their PTSA funds. I worked at a continuum of services school last year, which is also known as an inclusion school. And I wrote a grant to have the PTSA fund materials to make 10 boards of those large core boards to be distributed so that every preschool, kindergarten, first grade, and special ed teacher could have one all ready to go in their classroom. And then we also looked at budgets across the district to tap into any remaining funds that were beyond just the SLP budget or the AT department budget. So we also tapped into some money that we found in our continuum of services team budget, or our inclusion program budget. Now this year, with all the budget cuts that everyone's facing, it might be a little bit different, but perhaps in years to come. Okay, so the next on our roadmap was training. what good will all these materials do for us if no one knows how to use them, right? So while we were developing the materials, we also rolled out a somewhat systematic approach to training. I started in my first year as an AT specialist with training our SLP group. Because as I mentioned before, I had noticed that there was a very large discrepancy between SLPs even within our district. I wanted to make sure that everyone was up to date on what is core vocabulary and best practices for implementation. And then that led to specific building trainings, and they were done either by me or by the building SLP or both of us together. We also trained specific groups like paraeducators in different school buildings, and I even did a training for our OTPT group. Finally, we offered district-wide trainings that were available for anyone to come join. And so I did like a really large one for all the preschool, and it was in the evening when they were able to come, and that was a really powerful training. I'm now putting together on-demand trainings that can be completed for clock hours as well. So what do I cover in these trainings? I like to talk about AAC in general, core vocabulary, aided language stimulation. Those top three are the main things that I cover. If I have time, if it's like a 2-hour training, I'll talk about descriptive teaching. And then that's where I see a lot of light bulbs go off, especially for the teachers. And in every single training that I do, I make sure there's lots of time for practice. I always have a variety of different types of core boards available, not just our Bellevue School District board, but also boards from other companies, just so people can try out different boards and practice talking to each other and practice aided language stimulation. So while I, of course, enjoy any opportunity to talk about AAC, I think it's really important to include the building-based SLP wherever possible. People want to hear from someone that they know and someone that they trust. And what better way to do this than to recruit the building SLP, who will also then build her own confidence in the process while she's talking through the training. So one thing I did to support this was I put together a PowerPoint template that had the basic information that I cover on each topic that I showed in the last slide. And this way, the building SLP could just take this template and modify it to work for their school instead of spending all that time putting together something brand new. Again, I'm just trying to break down all those barriers wherever possible. You know, I know people will say, well, I don't have time to put together a whole training to do. Well, here's a template. Now you don't need as much time. Okay, this is the fun part, implementation. So this is where it really started to get fun. Once some people have been trained, some boards are created and they're out there, then it's time to run with it. I always suggest starting really small. You don't have to have every SLP or every teacher in every building across the whole district doing this right from the beginning. It works really well if you just find one school building maybe, or maybe one SLP who is interested and ready to run with it and just start there. It will gain momentum over time. And within the building, it can be helpful to pick just one teacher or target just one classroom to start with as well. In this picture here, you see my coworker who was another SLP leading a circle time in a preschool class using the Big Core board. I have found that the easiest starting places are often preschool and kindergarten classrooms because teachers are really interested in working on that literacy piece as well. So teachers easily see the benefit for all their students in that universal approach. And then of course, don't forget, just another note at the bottom there, that the most beneficial training that you can give is to coach teachers and therapists in real time too. So I could do a whole training on just implementation, but for the sake of time, I'll give you just a few of simple ideas. In one of my kinder classrooms last year, I would lead whole group shared reading activities with the Big Core board to model for the teacher how she might do the same thing in a future lesson. So I actually created some PowerPoints with the book that I was planning to read, and I would paste in 1 to 3 symbols in the corner as a reference point for the teacher. So not for the student necessarily, but for the teacher. And this way she could replicate the same story later in the week and remember the types of symbols that she might model on the big core board for each page. I found that this was a really good way to reinforce that the core word that's modeled on each page doesn't necessarily have to be the exact word that's read in the book. So for example, the text on the top page up there says planted a kiss, and the symbols say put in. So, the teacher might be looking for the symbol for plant or kiss and not be able to find it, but just modeling that you can use other core words that are similar, but not exactly the same. Another suggestion is to implement core vocabulary and shared writing activities like predictable chart writing. For this same example, we followed this story by making a T-chart for a shared writing activity where the sentence stem was I like, and the students came up with ideas of what they liked to complete the sentence. And I did have one target student in the class who was using Proloquo to Go, which is why you see symbol sticks there, symbol sticks images instead of Boardmaker. And so then she was watching all of her classmates using symbols to talk. It was very powerful. And when she came up to do her shared writing, she touched I like, and then touched the object of what she wanted to say that she liked. And these photos were taken in a kindergarten class with a fabulous teacher who was brand new to inclusion, and she had a nonverbal student in her class using Proloquo to Go. This teacher was very nervous to try this at the start of the year, but we started small. We met and we picked just one target word. So in this case, it was the word see. When we met together, she and I took a blank copy of her daily schedule, and she came up with examples of how she could integrate the word see into different parts of her school day. So you can see in the image in the middle and on the right, those were actually what she put up during songs, YouTube songs that she would play. And they were color songs and shape songs, and she would model the word see. And the student was working on combining two symbols. So we would model see in the shape or see in the color. And the image on the left, you'll see the teacher, but also the building principal. And I always try to include administration where and when it's possible so that they are also invested in the work that we're doing. This principal is fabulous, and her school was new to the inclusion program, so she was very invested and excited to learn about AAC. And this also proved to be very beneficial when I was later looking for creative sources of funding to pay for some of the big core boards, because she was on board and ready to run. These pictures were taken in a PE class. So in this building last year, one of the first teachers who was ready to run with me was the PE teacher of all people. This was a first for me, so I was like really excited about it. She had me do a whole class explanation of what the big core board was. And then she made me be one of the stations during their PE lesson. So while the other stations, kids were working on jump roping, I think it was in 2 other stations, when they'd rotate around and come to my station, we practiced giving and following commands using the core board. So we did things like go fast, go slow, up, down, and the kids, so one kid would give the direction and then the other kids would all do it. And it was so much fun. And of course, my target student thought it was hilarious. She had a great time. One suggestion I have is to find a district-wide shared space to collect implementation resources as well. So I mentioned this before with the boards, but also for your implementation resources. This is a clip here of the Teams files page that I mentioned. I house all of the AAC book and board templates here, as well as implementation ideas and resources and all sorts of things. Some teachers and SLPs in our district are following along with Practical AAC's Year of Core, if you've heard about that, which offers a small selection of core words that you suggested to target each month. So every month I send out the suggested words, and the link in Practical AAC also comes with book ideas that target those same words and other materials like this calendar that you see here. Some teachers and therapists find it really helpful to follow a structured plan like this, so they really target certain words each month. And then one final implementation I just wanted to mention today was something that I like to do called a circle of friends, or it can be called a circle of support. And so what we do for this, the SLP and the teacher, SLP or the teacher or the AT specialist or someone else, whoever's involved, can lead a lesson for a classroom and explain what AAC is and explain what maybe are some expected and unexpected behaviors for peers who are engaging with someone who speaks using AAC, and much more. So I usually like to bring in a bunch of extra devices and or boards, and then we talk. You can see in the presentation there, it's kind of blurry, but it says the talker is her voice. So we talk all about AAC, and then we practice using those devices if the kids want to. If they don't want to, they don't have to. But they can practice answering or asking questions using the device, and kids always just get a hoot out of that. They think it's so fun. And I find that to be extremely supportive in those classes with AAC users. Okay, so the final thing on our rollout plan here is playground and other spaces. So big core boards on the playground have been all the rage the past year or two. And I love this list of reasons that Sarah Gregory, who is an AT specialist out of Ithaca, New York, she put this on her social media page. She just mentioned that they make schools more inclusive and accessible. When kids are out on the playground, it's really hard to hold their communication system and play at the same time. So this offers a place where they can run and point to words and then run back and play. Obviously, we know students always need access to the communication, so these boards are there and ready. But of course, we have to remember these boards always need to be taught, just like any other form of AAC. And even if students aren't using it one day, it also increases the representation of AAC in the school community, which I think is really powerful. When our district was ready to make a playground board, we went back to that AAC group and we talked through what additional vocabulary words we thought should be added to the board. In addition to that, I also got input from PE teachers and recess teachers in our district. There are many, many different options for printing and mounting, but I wanted to find something that was pretty inexpensive. So I found a funding source from our district that came from that continuum of service department that I mentioned. And they actually helped me purchase playground boards for all of our elementary schools across the whole district. We even printed English and Spanish for our Spanish dual and immersion schools, and English and Mandarin for our Mandarin dual language schools. Of course, this picture that you see here was like a few weeks before everything shut down. I think this was in February. I had just put it up in the preschool playground area of my school that I worked at. All the kids were just so excited to see it. They all ran over right away, and they were used to seeing it from in their classroom already as well, but they were very excited for it. Then of course, everything shut down. So this is just a couple pictures of what it looks like the last picture was in the preschool playground area. This is in the the more general playground area. And we just used materials I went through Vistaprint, and I just printed a large vinyl banner with grommets in the corner and just zip tied it to the fence. It was really easy. It was really cheap. Vistaprint always has sales. I think each board ended up being definitely less than $50. I think with the promotion, maybe like $40 per board. It was really easy to put up, and it's also really easy to sadly take back down when everything closes for coronavirus. And it's inexpensive enough where if it gets damaged by the sun or something happens to it, we can just purchase more. So there are so many wonderful things that have come up from our district-wide core vocabulary initiative, but here is my personal top list. The biggest reward so far: increased district-wide knowledge and awareness of AAC, helping all students. So as I mentioned in the beginning, having that kind of tier 1 universal communication approach, you are helping potentially students with unidentified disabilities, those multi-language learners, pre-readers, all students, and increased representation of AAC in our school community. So what is next for our district? We're basically just going to keep on keeping on. More training, more buildings. Of course, now we're trying to adapt everything still to the remote setting or the hybrid. We've got some kids in person, some kids remote. For me personally, I am really interested in working with our district's curriculum developers to continue to increase exposure to AAC and to build out increased supports for literacy skills for our emerging communicators. I know literacy has been kind of a hot topic in AAC lately as well. So I'm interested in promoting that in our district too. All right, so look at that. We still have 14 minutes for questions and collaboration. So does anyone have any questions?
Hey, Sarah, this is Rose. Earlier, I posted a question from me for everyone's benefit, but how many SLPs are in our district for your, it's reference to your AAC group?
Yeah, so we have currently, I believe, 28 or 29, but several of ours are part-time.